Hello and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Hauk, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 38th installment in our ongoing series. Our October 2025 episode features an interview with author, filmmaker, and IGS trustee Nora Bateson, who is also president of the International Bateson Institute and the creator of the Warm Data Labs initiative. Her conversation with IGS President Lance Strate centers on the current sense that we are experiencing multiple crises, or what has been referred to as a polycrisis or metacrisis. They also touch on topics such as science communication, therapy, the family, language, AI, and storytelling, and draw upon media ecology, warm data, and of course, general semantics. Let's listen in.
Welcome to another episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. I'm here with Nora Bateson, who's a trustee of the IGS, as well as a force in her own right. And we're here to talk about stuff. Hi, Nora.
Hi, Lance. It's great to do this again.
It is. It's great for us to have you on again. And I thought we would talk about, and really the term, I first saw it from you, of the polycrisis or the metacrisis or the meta-polycrisis or the polywally-doodle crisis. I'm not sure what it's going on, but, what exactly are we talking about now?
Yeah, the terminology maybe isn't that important, but the comprehension or the perception, I think, is very important of the way that there are these different crises that are entangled in one another and actually exacerbating each other and pretty impossible to pull apart. And, we all have been trained since we were sort of young that when you have a complex problem, the first thing you have to do is simplify. And in order to simplify, you divide things out that somehow seem consequential or irrelevant.
Analysis is exactly that process, yeah. Yeah,
and this doesn't work right now. Mm-hmm. It, in fact, obscures the necessary connectivity, but more than connectivity, it's the necessary, the forging that's happened between different contexts of issues. So you think you can, approach a political crisis, but it's actually an economic crisis. And in the economic crisis, it's also a health crisis. And the health crisis is also an education crisis. And the education crisis is also an ecological crisis. It's also a food crisis. And so it's impossible to get them apart. And then we add AI.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But it seems awfully inconvenient to not have to be, or to not be presented with one crisis at a time so that we can focus on one or the other.
Yeah, well, I think it was a false convenience to begin with. I think the idea that we could ever do that with things like health or education or mental health or, any of these things that we're listing here was an illusion anyway. And very often the solution to a problem in one context created all sorts of other problems in other contexts. You can actually, for example, you can produce high yield farming, but there's a consequence. And there's a consequence in the soil, but there's also consequences in terms of people's health. There's also consequences in terms of distribution and economy and culture. The culture of the farming, the culture between the genders that are holding the different roles within farming. So the issues that appear to be solvable never were. It was just this illusion that we had, and now it feels like you just can't get away with it anymore.
Well, I guess maybe that's the thing of not being able to get away with it anymore, because it seemed like we've gotten away with it for centuries, and that the sort of the ascendancy of the West was based on this idea that we can isolate problems, work on them, and come up with solutions, and then move on from there.
And I think that the real disaster here was that it worked.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a history, as sort of statistical proof, but beyond statistical proof, I think there's an embodied logic of experience that worked. It was effective, it optimized, it was productive.
Right.
And so now there is this very real fear of how do you actually approach a problem that is in this meta-poly complexity.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have the convenience of isolating and creating a kind of linear strategy, what are you going to do? And
Right.
the panic there is a panic that I think is instilled in most boards of directors. It's in most, how would you know that you had accomplished something if you didn't set out to accomplish that one thing and then measure the results?
Right, exactly.
How would you know? Maybe it would be a total waste of money. It would be a waste of time. It would be like, are we just naive? And I think for a long time, there has been, certainly systems theory and complexity theory are not new.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somehow getting past that place of recognizing that a system is complex and that the systems are changing each other to actually thinking about how do we respond to this in ways that are in the same systemic patterning as the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Remember, in algebra, you can't add oranges to apples. You can't add X's and Y's. They have to be congruent. And so in the same way, we have to respond with variables, what was called requisite variety. But even that became mechanistic, and it just turned into, what we need is a bigger spreadsheet.
Right.
And again, the bigger spreadsheet obscured the way that all these different things are changing each other. Right? So you could have a big spreadsheet, for example, on some sort of health issue. Let's say there's a lot of people right now dealing with various gut issues.
Right.
And if you were to say, okay, this is partially due to pesticides, it's partially due to stress, it's partially due to antibiotics, it's partially due to farming techniques, it's partially due to sleep habits, it's partially due to, various things. You could have a big spreadsheet to deal with the economics of it, the laws, all the pieces that are in there. But
right.
Each line of research coming in is still a line of decontextualized research.
But let me play devil's advocate here, and isn't this what on the on this populist movement that we're experiencing, that is exactly what they're saying, and so whatever facts or statistics are presented about the efficacy of vaccines, for example, and they're saying, well, no, you're not, that's not true. That you can't go by facts and figures. You have to go by feelings. And so now we have outbreaks of measles that didn't exist before, apart from how well it helped us to overcome COVID-19, that pandemic, I mean, is the resurgence of diseases that we thought we had totally eradicated because people are refusing the vaccines. Just as, an example of that, but, of course, there's the denial of climate science. How do you establish that there is a problem except through facts and figures? Otherwise, it's like your opinion, my opinion, how you feel about it. Or maybe it's like, well, we had a lot of snow this winter, so there can't be global warming, can there? Those kinds of anecdotal evidence that is being invoked.
I totally agree.
So
and I think this is one of the reasons that there is a cultural susceptibility to this kind of confusion, is that for too long, the kind of research that would be the research of how these different systems are shaping each other, how they are connected, that research we don't have a history of having that research. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been done. And so there's not that thing to reach for. But I agree, we need the research and we need to be able to reach for it. And the crisis right now is that it's what I would call the warm data, right? The relational information, it has not been acknowledged. And so when people say, but how do you know? And it's all fake news. I think one of the things they're saying is that there was a lot of relational information here that wasn't taken into account that makes this information contaminated or directed or at least biased and definitely inadequate in one way or another. Mm-hmm. And they're not wrong about that. They may be wrong about their outcomes of, how they make deduction from there. But the fact is that for example, with the vaccine thing.
Yeah.
I don't think it's wrong to question the big pharma companies. Mm-hmm. And especially, after the opioid crisis.
Right.
Millions of families were promised things, and people were given these medications for little surgeries and little knee hurts and backaches that destroyed entire families and communities, and they were promised that everything was okay.
Right.
And immediately, it was right in the middle of the opioid crisis, let's keep in mind, which isn't over yet, that the pandemic comes and it's, but believe us, these vaccines are perfectly safe. And of course people didn't believe it. Mm-hmm. They were maybe dealing with other experiences viscerally, personally, intimately, in which the pharmaceutical companies had put their own profits ahead of people's well-being. So they weren't wrong.
And they also hid the facts.
Yeah.
Right. And they still were, relatively kind of specialized, isolated set of facts that opioids are extremely addicting. And, they basically didn't communicate them, hid them away. And, that's part of a consequence of deviating from the tradition that scientific research is supposed to be open and verifiable, and that anyone can examine the results. But once it got sequestered into a private corporation, that's where we start to run into problems, and that is actually a return, in a way, to the medieval period, where even as late as Leonardo da Vinci kept all his findings in secret code, and so had no impact on the direction of modern science, whereas the ones who came a little bit later put their findings out, they published them, because they had the printing press. They put them out and available for others to evaluate, test, and verify.
So, we're just beginning to see, I think, a different approach to some of this research where, there are a few inputs. One is, I think, certainly around the gut bacteria. The gut bacteria is generating all sorts of research, not only about digestion, but about social behavior and the way that the gut informs social behavior, the relationship between the gut and the ecology and the seasons, the relationship between the gut and various other physical and mental health issues. But it comes all the way out into the legality of using particular pesticides, of various kinds of imports, of international trade issues. So it's a use of antibiotics, the production of antibiotics. So I think there's, this is one of the spots where the research is moving into a transcontextual space that is actually very complex. We need that in a lot of places. Another place where I have seen this is in terms of mycelia and the relationship between the mycelia and trees in forests, and the way the mycelia are actually carrying nutrients and communication between trees so that the trees in a forest can actually nourish each other. Mycelia. But these sort of multi-contextual, multi-relational processes require a different approach to the research. So the research is necessary, but to your point, I am not at all saying this, we need to think about how it feels. I think what I'm saying is the rigor that we're looking for is much, much more intricate and complex than the one that we have been, that we have on hand. Okay, so a good deal of the issue is that a lot of research is based on previous research.
Right.
If that research was faulty in its foundations, then you're sort of throwing bad research on top of bad research. But the spirit of it is not to be underestimated. The spirit of the research and that is a beautiful thing. The quest for understanding and for science and for, I come from a family of scientists. Like this is something that is very dear and true to me. And so I'm not in any way throwing that baby out with the bathwater. Just, I think, recognizing that in this meta, poly, omni, multi-crisis that we're in, the way of seeking information and then communicating it, okay? Because that's the next problem. How do you communicate research? What does the document look like? Who's it for? Because so much, I think, of the way that research has been reduced was through not only the need to study just one thing at a time, but also to communicate that one thing to the people who studied that one thing.
Right.
And so it's not just a problem of research, it's a problem of the whole culture of, you're in academia, you know what I'm talking about. And it's an issue because you need the depth, and the specialization is really important to have that depth.
Right.
Right? You need that. But at the same time, if that's all you have, it becomes a hindrance. It again obscures a lot of information.
Well, it's one thing when we have experts who need essentially their own language to communicate with one another. And then on the other side, you have the need to communicate to the public And so, I mean, which is a whole area of science communication, but it often falls very short of the reality of things because, because of that simplification and that need to find, that hook for the news story or the headline, and to reduce complex findings to a simple answer, or to take something that may be statistically significant but still not overwhelming and turn that into an absolute statement, to get from the the specific kind of qualifications that come out of a scientific study and turn that into an allness statement, like, which we've been driving people crazy about for decades now, for most of my life, about what foods are bad for you and what foods are good for you, and then like a decade or two later, it turns out that what was bad for you is what's good for you, or we're still waiting for tobacco to be determined to be healthy, but that probably won't come up. But so much more of these reversals keep coming up, and that seems to just totally confuse people and delegitimize what researchers are doing.
Well, again, if you research in a reduced set of parameters, that's too reduced, okay? Because it's always going to be reduced in some way. You can't study the entire system all from every direction, right? So there's always going to be reduction. You're always going to, draw a line around that aspect of a system that you're studying. The trick is not to forget that you drew the line. Mm-hmm. That the line you drew is arbitrary, and I think that's where there's a certain sort of hubris where it's like, but I'm an expert in the education system. And it's like, yeah, but that's actually culture. It's actually, intergenerational family communication. That's actually the economy. That's actually, much more a part of the, development of technology. It's much more about the forming of an individual and the whole notion of individualism, identity, mental health. Right? How do you keep a workforce going? So, where's the edge of the education system again? How do you be an expert in the education system? So the question of how then the research is done and how it's communicated. And I think right now we are in a crisis right there because, I have actually spoken with lots of people who would like to transmit their results of their study or their work, and do so in ways that are complex, but they get shut down because the journalism is operating under the impression that basically you need, first of all, controversy, you need a binary, and therefore you need a simple reductionist description that hopefully can become a meme, and hopefully it will generate polarity. Right? And this is exactly the opposite of what actually we need to be working with in terms of the communication here.
Yeah. Well, it's either the polarity or just the kind of surprise value, right? I mean, that's an old adage that, man bites dog is news, not dog bites man, so if it's something that you thought was benign is now dangerous, that's the news story, so that's what we'll get. It's
that tension in either case of, of that, the receiver of the information thinking, what? Right? I'm just going to say that from my understanding and experience, I think it's a huge underestimation of people being unable to take in the complexity of something that they're actually living in, and they're actually living in that complexity. So in my work, I see it all the time that kids are perfectly capable of understanding that education isn't just in the school.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're perfectly capable of understanding that food isn't just about the nutrients. It's about culture. It's about economy. It's about, so they're perfectly capable of holding the complexity. The same is true, is especially true in working with communities or groups of people who have been really betrayed by the existing systems, forgotten and betrayed. So they don't have the care they need, the schools they need. Their communities are split and broken. And in those places, and it is absolutely vivid that the perception of the struggle is a perception of something that has multiple contexts that are in play. The struggle did not come from one direction. By contrast, so often when I am working with people who have a lot of comfort and identity within the existing establishments, the understanding is that their comfort and their success came from a monolinear causal process, which is it's an interesting problem trying to talk them out of that.
Yeah.
And so it's I think a big mistake to underestimate audiences, that they can't understand complexity, because they can. And at this point, it's very frustrating to even, kind of notice the various formats of public communication that exist. So I do a lot of keynote speaking and panel discussions. So do you. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with this right now, because I don't really want to do a keynote again, because you have whatever it is, 60 minutes to address something, and it doesn't really matter what it is. 60 minutes is not enough. And the format of what we have, sort of enculturated as a communicational release of information and studies and research is hindering what it is that can be expressed.
So you're probably thinking the same thing about this podcast.
Well,
since we're have a limited period of time.
Okay, but that's a really interesting question, Lance, because there's something else happening in the podcast that is kind of beyond the transcript, which is a set of assumptions that you and I are sharing, and a set of understandings and relationships and care and respect between us. And that includes the way that you do your work and the integrity that you have in the work that you do and the integrity that I have. And so without us, kind of tackling a particular subject as though we're only talking about that subject, there's a lot of information that is transmitting between us beyond what is the topic.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth asking the question, like, why is it that in a conversation like this, there's something else happening? And how do we actually bring that into other contexts in some way? I don't have an answer to that. I'm asking it, really sincerely, because I've been in these situations recently where audiences are for or against you, and every word is a flag that, each sentence could be your last before you get canceled.
Well, that has been quite a problem in our time. Didn't used to be that way, but in recent decades, that seems to be more and more troubling. But you were saying, I mean, just before about a keynote not being enough time, and I mean, it's always kind of relative, it seems to me, because when I have a whole semester of teaching a class, and I often feel, well, if we had more time, we could do a lot more, and that's an enormous amount of time, relatively speaking. I mean, a keynote is a lot of time too, but I find usually, I write things out, and then I have to cut out in order to get it down into that manageable amount of time. But still, there's a chance to at least develop ideas. But I was thinking about, when we're talking about media, and particularly, being quoted, for example, in a news story, I would guess you've had a similar experience where you can spend, say, half an hour, 45 minutes talking to a journalist, and coming out with all these brilliant ideas, that, pop into your head as you're addressing some kind of specific issue. And then they pick the most banal part of the interview as what they include, because that works its way into the narrative and into the kind of simplistic direction they want the story to go into.
Mm-hmm.
And at least some of this, as we're talking about, people. I love your point about audiences, and it's great to hear that optimistic view that people aren't stupid. When you can talk to them about it, they can understand the interrelationships. So the problem isn't the audience then. Perhaps the problem is in, as you like to say, the medium. And we could go back to Korzybski, who saw the problem in language, that language simplifies the complexity of physical reality, and all the more so with our audiovisual media and our social media that always simplify things, that we don't get long, complex explanations, to the extent that we even have articles anymore. They're shorter, and they just are not capable of getting into the nuances of things in the way that earlier kinds of publications used to, that people's attention spans have decayed to a large extent because they're used to a barrage of stimulation coming from media that focus on fast turnover of things. Back in 1979, Neil Postman's book, Teaching as a Conserving Activity, he talked about television as an attention-centered medium, that, and in contrast to schools, which he talked about as being content-centered. Whether it's school or print, it's like you have to arrange your content in a coherent way that makes sense, that has a logic to it. But television, it's all about, as he liked to put it, and now this, just moving from one kind of attention-getting kind of piece of, segment of content to another in a very fragmented, discontinuous kind of way. So, at least I would throw out that's so much, and then we get to what we were talking about before, science communication. How do you communicate a complex, nuanced set of interrelationships in a medium that seems to be biased towards the exact opposite kind of content?
Exactly. Like how to even express the fact that essentially, I think what I'm saying here and what I'm yearning for is to nourish the possibility of perception. Mm-hmm. That goes beyond, identifying a singular thing and notice that whatever it is you're talking about is actually entangled in a lot of other contextual relational processes, whatever it is. Dog collars, furniture making, design, breakfast cereal, it doesn't matter. Everything is that. And so that if we can nourish that, that sort of immediate perception. And for me, so I try to work on that in people's most sort of intimate lives, to start to see the moments of your day, the way that you are with your dog, your kids, your spouse, you're in relationship to your own body, like the very intimate stuff that matters, okay? Because it has to matter. Mm-hmm. It has to matter to you in a different kind of way than reading some random news story that you doom scroll past, So it's and in that sort of more intimate, personal place, beginning to perceive these interconnections and complexity can then become a basis from which you can perceive other things. Mm-hmm. And then when you perceive a story that doesn't have the complexity, you can add your own, right? You can begin to say, okay, this is a very limited peephole into what's happening in this subject, but it's an interesting peephole. Mm-hmm. But without that, you might not recognize that it's a peephole. You might think that's the story, that's the information, that's the thing.
Right.
And so I guess there's this.
But, when you say you add your own, how do you then tell that your own story isn't the wrong story? How do you check to make sure that, and how do we engage in reality testing, error checking when we're adding our own story?
But I think when I'm saying you add your own, what I'm really saying is you add the humility of not knowing. You add the complexity that you don't know.
Right.
So say, okay, this is part of the story. There's a lot more to it. I don't know what it is.
Right.
This is not the entirety.
I like that. That's Mary Lehman makes that point about the general semantics principle of non-allness, that teaches us humility, because we can never know it all. We can never understand it all. We can never express it all. So
I think that some people call it these days epistemic humility.
That sounds weighty.
It does, doesn't it? But I think that at least gives us some way of being in relationship with other people, with different circumstances, that says, okay, there's something happening here that is more than I know. Mm-hmm. And there's an opening for curiosity. There's an opening for inquiry. There's an opening to learn more.
Right.
And learn more and learn more. And, the old adage, the more you know you don't know. So that humility should probably be, building itself as you go along. I don't know, though, because the question is what is the way that the media, like you're saying, is already caught in patterns of communication and meta-communication that are holding exactly the opposite of that humor. Right? It hasn't been allowed. And so I don't know, do we need a new medium?
Yes. Well, at least from the kind of media ecology point of view, that yes, we need other media that have different biases, because if you work against the bias of a particular medium, you don't get content that's very effective that people will flock to. So you could have, the example is C-SPAN on television. Nobody watches it. It is a use of television, the TV camera, set it up and broadcast the proceedings of government, but that doesn't attract people. It's like Fox News, on the other hand, came up with the formula, which is, a lot of drama, a lot of good-looking people. And they really capitalized and extended the formula for TV news generally. That's how you do it. So we're kind of waiting on it. I mean, I don't know if AI is going to do that. I fear it's going to substitute rather. I mean, it might impose a new form of rationality that's been missing in this electronic era, but might do that without human participation, which is kind of scary in its own right.
I mean, I know that you are a poet, and I also like to write poetry, but I'm hesitant to even say those words because it's not just writing poetry. Mm-hmm. Writing poetry is something that is consequential of perceiving life in a poetic way. And for me, that holds a lot more of the movement of a complex system than prose. Because the prose are constantly sitting flat and making statements that have endpoints that are not changeable.
Right.
And there's a space for that. I'm not denying it. I'm just saying that in this moment, there's this poetic perception, not just the writing of poetry, but the poetic perception is a way of opening that humility. It's like when you are standing still. If you and I were both standing fairly still and throwing a ball back and forth, we would be attending to the ball in a different way. If we were both running and throwing the ball, our attention would be really differently placed around how to receive that ball and to throw it. Right? So when you're looking at something that appears to be stable, you look differently, you perceive differently, you focus differently than if you're in motion. And I think in all the time that I've been playing around with ideas of ecology, the biggest problem that I've had in the communication, even of ecological principles, is the habit and the need, the tendency, I'm going to go ahead and say the addiction to trying to describe it as a static system. And it's not static, and that's the big problem. It's moving, it's learning, it's shifting, it's changing.
Right.
And this is one of the problems with models.
Yeah.
It can't hold the movement. It's the problem with the language. It's not holding the movement.
Well, that was part of Korzybski's whole thing, right? That language implies this kind of static situation. And he did try to come up with ideas about how to, at least modify that by, those techniques or the devices, the dating things, for example, which still makes them static, but at least it indicates that things can change by indicating what period of time you're talking about, rather than just talking about it as if it's eternal and fixed, and indexing to indicate different versions of the same word or different levels of abstraction of the same term, and using that etc. all the time. Using, as they say, scare quotes, quotation marks too. But at a certain point, it makes it hard to communicate. If you do all of this all the time, it's like you can never say anything after a while if you go too far in that direction.
Agreed. You have to have an ecology of communication. You're going to have some prose, and you're going to have some poetry, and you're going to have some reductionist research, and you're going to have some expansive, explorative, transcontextual process. And all these different types of exploration will then leak over into each other. In the way that the different organisms in a meadow shape and keep each other nourished. We have to have lots of different kinds of communication. Otherwise, all of it's nonsense. And so I think, when people are in this moment trying to find out what is the information that I need to create a response to these metacrises, these complex situations, these polycrises, omnicrises, how do I respond? So the ability to make a decision, to perform an action, is somehow informed, right? What is the information that I need to actually produce a response to these difficult situations that exist from the minutia of our personal lives to our communities, to our ecosystems, to our geopolitical wars, and so on. So how do I know? And when people are feeling like those guys are lying, this isn't true, they're not wrong. But they're also not right. And in some way or another, there's something happening around this kind of meltdown that we're in. That I think is an important, this is one of the reasons that I am so interested in general semantics. And I think where the intersection of warm data and general semantics really comes together is right here. Like, what is the information? How do we think about information in a different way so that, and communicate it, so that we're actually addressing some very big mistakes that were produced, as you said earlier in this conversation, through a sense of convenience that's outlived its shelf date.
Yeah.
And it's not convenient anymore. It just splits people apart.
So you mentioned dealing with people's sort of individual problems and, sort of the kind of therapeutic aspect of, it's very much been an aspect of general semantics, although not technically a therapy, but certainly it's something that has therapeutic value and has informed other therapies, some of which I know you're familiar with, like Fritz Perls and Gestalt therapy and that sort of thing. But how does that, relate to the big picture, again, of the poly-meta, omni, meta, uni crisis that we're talking about? In some ways, the criticism coming from kind of Marxist theory, among others, is that therapy, therapy in particular, and this is also Jacques Ellul's point about technology, that it's a technique used to have people adjust to society. That is the traditional goal of therapy is proper adjustment to society. When the society is the problem and you're getting people to adjust to it, if you have a totalitarian and society, and then you use these techniques to get people adjusted to it, to a kind of Orwellian situation, then that's not solving the problem, that's exacerbating it. So, how do we move from one level, from the level of the personal, and it's like in the same way, I could not have a phone, I cannot travel by plane. There's so many things that I personally could choose to do that might be beneficial for me as a individual, but that does nothing to address the omni, meta, poly, doodle crisis that we're talking about.
I mean, this is like the crisis, right? So there's a lot of, I think, really well-placed criticism on a lot of the self-help, pop psychology, mindfulness that alleviated people's stress instead of allowing them to actually feel the stress and dealing with the stress itself, right? So you can do this meditation and then you can have more stress. Right? Same exact metaphor used with pesticides and glyphosates, right? So we're going to increase the plant's capacity for taking on more of these chemicals, so that it won't kill the plant, but it will kill the insects who have become immune to it. So there's a few things here, and one of them is, I don't think that it's a good idea to be, making people be able to participate more in the existing systems that are destructive, not only to themselves, but the world around them. My dad used to ask this question that I think comes into play here. It's a bit of a heartbreaker. Of what is the project, what is the way, what is the nourishment of realizing that we are in a time when we could very easily be witnessing tens, if not hundreds of millions of people in fatal situations, from war, from famine, from pestilence, from disease. And his question was, how do we actually ensure that there are some thousands of, if not millions of people remaining whose ability to be in love with life and to be creative in the face of disaster is not ruined? Right? So living in a time of all of this trauma, which is a word we hear every day now, and intergenerational trauma, cultural trauma, industrial trauma, physical, mental, emotional, right? How do we stop damaging each other? So for me, when I'm thinking of what that therapeutic thing is, I'm interested in something that I have perceived in many ways, but one of the things is that, so let's look at the family unit. Okay, this is sort of the oldest institution, is the family, and not just the nuclear family, but the family. And but when I say family, I don't just mean blood kin. Right? I mean extended people who are there for you at 4 a.m. Those people. And those are the people who are covering for each other. Right? So when you get stressed out, if you fall down the stairs, if you get sick and you can't go to work, if your children need care, when your elders need care, it's the family that's covering for the businesses, right? And there has been some rope, some fat, some pocket, a cache of energies and care and relational nourishment that has been tapped all the way dry. And so now we look at families and people in families, because everybody's in a family in one way or another, and we may look at them and we may say, oh, that person has this set of issues because they made bad decisions. They got addicted. They went bankrupt. They, chose the wrong college degree. They this, they that. They married the wrong person. They didn't get out of whatever. It's their fault from their decisions that they're caught in this crisis that is not so difficult to really draw out as a set of personal faults.
Right.
And what I would say is that if you look again, what you will see is that the global pressures of the economy, of the health system, of the education system, of the technologies are actually creating these really particular expressions of damage.
Mm-hmm.
And each person is expressing it differently. So it's not like you can say, oh, this causes that, and it will always look like that. Social media causes depression, and it will always look like depression. No, sometimes it looks like eating disorders, sometimes it looks like loneliness, sometimes it looks like sex addiction, sometimes it looks like, right? So in each particular space, you're getting expressions of the global problems through individual lives that are inside families that are covering. And they're running out of possibility to do that. They're running dry. And so I think that's for me kind of the second order question here is not how do we fix the individuals, but how do we nourish that source from which response will come to whatever comes up. Which is a really different thing than let's diagnose this problem and fix it.
Right.
It's a second order response of, well, it's the families that are actually holding this. And, in a meadow, you have redundancy. And the redundancy ecologically is really different than redundancy when we think about, that in terms of your employment, which basically means you're getting replaced, you're going to lose your job. But in a meadow, redundancy is something different. There's lots of different pollinators. There's not just bees. And the bees are having a hard year. The butterflies and the moths and the bats and the other organisms help out. They cover for each other. Okay, so that's the piece of this. When we look at how a meadow continues to make life, one of the ways it does it is because it has redundancy. And so how to nourish the redundancy in the community so that we can cover for each other. To me, that's what I mean by therapy.
Well, that sounds very promising. As a solution, I like that because going back to Claude Shannon, and redundancy is a way to overcome or minimize noise in a system. And thinking that, in this case, thinking about Jacques Ellul and how everything gets reduced to efficiency as the only criterion in technological societies, and the most efficient in the short run is to eliminate redundancy. That's the most efficient way to do things. But of course, in the long run, that ends up creating problems because things break down and there's no redundancy to compensate for that. But I'm thinking also, about the family, because part of it then has to do with changes to what the family itself is. Not to use that word, but what the family represents. We were talking about this at our New York State Communication Association conference the past weekend. Just about there was a session some folks were on the topic of kin keepers. Which is just the person who keeps the family network together, keeps the communication flowing, and keeps track of the history of the family. And and I just, in the Q&A session, I just pointed out how much the breakdown or the dissolution of the extended family hurts that. That when extended family all live together in the same area, in the same neighborhood, it was much easier to keep families together. We went from that to the nuclear family in the post-war period, but the nuclear family itself has broken up. And so family as that system that you're pointing to is itself much harder to maintain.
Absolutely. And there's so much intergenerational horror and harm. That there's, a lot of people who don't talk to at least several members of their family. They aren't in communication at all.
Yeah.
Because the linking and the ongoing repeating cycles of damaging communication and various humiliation, abuse, etc. And there's no place like the family for that to take place. So while the family can be a place of healing and nourishment, it's also a place of harm. And one of the real, I talking to my kids, I'm just sort of always in this conversation with them around like, okay, so how do we break the matrix? Like, how do we learn from what was good to learn from in the past, but not justify the stuff that was harmful, so that we don't have to repeat it together. Like I do not want to be in repeating cycles of damage with my kids. I really, really, really want to set them free.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing, because there are habits and like grammar patterns that lead you into super damaging, humiliating situations with each other.
Right.
And they're nigh invisible, because they're so of the water in which we have been swimming that it's just how life is, speaking of is. But it isn't.
Right.
It isn't how it is. And so changing those things, is hard, and it hurts. Especially, what happened to me recently? I got called an elder.
Oh.
Yeah. How about that? So
Welcome to the club.
but what a beautiful and lovely and actually kind of terrifying thing. But it's, I think, really important as, our generations hit this elder place, that we're communicating something different, which is not, this is how it is. But there's been a lot of harm done, and we don't want to repeat it. And maybe I'm not even sure how to do that. But again, with the not knowing, it's okay to not know that.
Well, see, on the other side, then the solution isn't to give up on the family altogether and just become an isolated individual, because that is the most destructive, kind of development of all. And I think, again, of Elul there on the point that individuals are what you need to create a mass, right? It's like people who are disconnected from one another, and so they become a mass of people who are easily manipulated. And again, that's, perhaps part of what we're seeing. When you talk about that, I also think about how many families have experienced a conflict, an unprecedented level of conflict, where there are members of the family who are no longer talking to one another over the political developments of the last decade, where I don't think that existed, to that extreme in previous times. That even during the American Civil War, I remember learning about this when I was, I joined a fraternity as an undergraduate, and part of our history was that the Civil War was the most tragic or saddest time in our fraternity's history because it was brother against brother. And they meant that literally, that, members of Beta Theta Pi from Southern universities were in the Confederate Army and members from Northern universities were in the Northern Army, and they had to fight against one another. But still, even there, I don't think it was as much of a division. I mean, maybe for the Booths, when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln, and Edwin Booth and the rest of the Booth family were horrified, and reportedly Edwin Booth never mentioned his brother, never by name ever again, except one time when he was drinking and he started to say, "My unfortunate brother John," and then stopped himself. But I think it was much rarer where now it's reportedly a fairly common phenomenon in families across the United States, where members of the family have cut each other off over politics. In a way, that's almost like this strategy, in a way, of divide and conquer. But to break apart the family is a very serious issue, very serious problem that maybe we're not really focusing on. We sort of see it as like, this is something that's happening and it's a terrible thing. And of course, it's terrible how members of the family can be totally brainwashed and so forth. But we're not really seeing it as part of this mega omni crisis that's going on.
Yeah, and I would argue that it is absolutely at the heart of it, because the issue of the isolated individual, okay, and I think the key word there is isolated. We're all individuals in one way or another, but when we get isolated, that individualism turns really toxic. And how we can perceive what is necessary to survive. Mm-hmm. Right? So what's necessary becomes a pretty good illustration of how to destroy an ecological system.
Yeah.
It's what becomes necessary for an isolated individual to survive is a set of separations and categories and broken, fragmented understandings that will allow the fragmentation to remain fragmented. So you have to have your own money, your own house, your own, your health is your own issue. Your children, well, screw them. If they don't get it together, then they blew it. Not my fault. I gave them a house and a home and they didn't thrive. I did my part.
Right.
They're on their own. There's, this brokenness breaks things.
Yeah. It's also an unintended consequence of the welfare state. And I don't want to go right wing on you, but, there is, the fact of the social safety net, which I'm entirely in favor of, and I mean, this is a necessity, and yet that takes away so much of the impetus of clinging to family as a survival mechanism.
For better and for worse. I mean, yeah. I live in Sweden, and it's been a very interesting learning for me around what happened. So the kind of emancipation that came with the social welfare system, where prior to that, the oppression of the family, of the church, really dictated who you could sleep with, what job you could have, where you could live, who you could be, what ideas you could have.
Right.
Right? And so the family and the church were really these oppressive systems. And then when social welfare arrived, people were emancipated. They didn't need the family to survive anymore. So they could sleep with who they wanted to sleep with, and they could have ideas that they wanted to have, and they could believe in whatever God they wanted or none at all. And this opened up a huge world of a renaissance. It was a renaissance. And it came at a very high cost, because this is my experience of being in Scandinavia, is that there just isn't really the existing presumption that people are there for each other. There's not a language for it. There's not cultural bridges there. There's no fiber that holds it. If you need something, you get it from the state. You don't get it from your family member or your friends. I mean, even in the States, if somebody has a baby, the girlfriends gather around and they, sign up to make dinners and do laundries. If someone's dying and there's a need for care, the family can take shifts. Okay, we have this in American culture. I tried to do that with some friends in Sweden, and my Swedish friends looked at me like I had fallen from Mars. What is she talking about? It didn't exist, and it was really hard for me to figure out how to be in a culture in which there isn't that thing that, Lance, if you needed me at 4 a.m, I would be there for you. If I was on the other side of the world, I wouldn't hesitate if you needed me. But that's something, again, I think so much of what we're trying to attend to is actually in this implicit world. And it's something implicit that that you have people who will be there for you.
Yeah.
And yeah, I agree with you. The social welfare system, if not held well, can really damage that. I had an interesting experience in Singapore, where I was doing some work with these Islamic family therapists. Malay Islamic family therapists, and they were working with women who were getting divorced under Sharia law. And that's a very complicated situation. And so I was asking them, what kind of support is there for these women and their children? What happens? And my therapist friends were looking at me like, what? And I asked again, what? How do you support them? And they looked at me like, huh? And of course, all of my assumptions started leaping in of, well, that's because they don't value women, right? And I went to that place. Eventually, we continued the conversation. Eventually, what I learned was, they said, now we understand what you're asking. Yeah. Well, the support goes to her family to support her, because otherwise she'll be alone. So there it is, the second order support to the family that allows the support of the woman who is raising the kids, because she can't do it alone. And I was like, yeah, but what about if the family doesn't like her? What if there's, rules? And they were like, well, this is part of what you have to take in. This is part of the risk, but it's less of a risk than, keeping her isolated.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because I didn't even have the language to ask the question. And the question that I was asking was so incomprehensible to them that they, it was so interesting, the cultural things that were implicit in the culture of that conversation.
And when you say about not having the language, it makes me wonder, just to get back to our mega, omni, poly, wally crisis, do we have the language not only to represent it, express it, but to deal with it or to talk about it at all? Or where do we find that language? And, it also speaks to the problem, and to use a term or a phrase from Habermas, of legitimacy crisis. But I think of in symbolic interaction, Hugh Duncan talks about this, that when a society falls apart, it's not because of disease or poverty or anything like that. It's that when people start no longer believe in their sacred symbols or the agreed upon kind of major symbols that unite them. It's a symbolic crisis. So do we have a crisis of symbolism? Are we, what happens when we no longer have the same maps, and we can't agree on how to map our territory?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, what I find most terrifying right now is the way that the notion of progress as being expressed by overcoming nature leads into the very dystopic possibility of AI, cyborg, sort of super intelligence as being further away from understanding who and how we are alive together. Mm-hmm. It becomes a violation of life itself. And somehow mechanistic control has been portrayed as the dominion of human beings, and I think the word is actually man's providence. And this is not a good set of symbols.
No. But it may be, where we're headed as the only way to agree upon a map is to let the AIs draw them. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it does present itself as a solution to what we're experiencing with this, meta crisis.
Or something. It could actually make it much, much, much worse, because it's not like it's landing in neutral territory. It's landing in a context of, organisms, human organisms that are already really confused. So I don't know. I think for me, the places where I've seen the greatest lift have been when people tell stories to each other. And through those stories, they can perceive each other's complexity and the complexity that we're living in.
Yeah.
A personal story holds all the contexts. We're living in a world that's already integrated. And we are integrated in it. And then somehow when we try to communicate about it, the aboutness gets all convoluted. It turns into these weird abstractions and scripts of abstractions and opinions of scripts of abstractions. And yet that very basic ancient art of just being together and telling stories, one thing that I have seen is that some kind of solidarity comes out of it, where people who are experiencing the difficulties of being alive in very different ways, they are able to perceive that it's the same configurations of institutions and patterns that are producing their different struggles. And that's, I think, significant.
Yeah.
Because it's not like this thing happened to me. It's we are in a situation that is actually distorting our ability to be together and be alive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a real shift.
Yeah. So storytelling is the way, kind of like the manifestation of relationships. It's like through storytelling, we create and maintain and strengthen our relationships to one another.
Yeah. And it's not like someone's going to say, if you tell them a story, they're not going to be like, your story is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of gets us out of that mess that the media and social medias have been creating.
I think that's a very important point to be making. I think the other thing I would throw out to that is to go meta, and if we can't agree on maps, then let's start talking about map making and how we make those maps. And if we have to talk about, even go up a level to how we talk about map making, how we talk about talking. Just to find the point where we can at least say, okay, here's a starting point, and let's start from here. Let's go back to this and point that we can agree upon, and then move from there back down to specifics. Because as you were pointing out, it's not the abstractions that's the problem. It's not knowing, not recognizing that you're dealing with abstractions. We use abstractions as because we have that capability, and it gives us the ability to do things that other forms of life can't do. So we need to employ that, but to do it properly and consciously and appropriately. Maybe that way we can agree on how to tell stories and how to tell ones that are productive and bring us together.
Yeah. It's like that wonderful piece in my dad's work about the guy who asks his computer. Of course, this was written in the 70s, right? So he asks his computer, do you compute you'll ever think like a human being? Which is some sort of extension of the Turing question, right?
Right.
And the computer bumps and it thumps because it was the 70s. And eventually it spits out a piece of paper because it was the 70s. And on the piece of paper is written, that reminds me of a story.
Yeah.
And, this little snippet is so lovely because what's interesting about sharing stories with each other is not the content of the stories. It's that when I tell you a story, it lights up your stories. You have impressions and memories and all sorts of things happen in you that are what Charles Saunders Peirce, I think, would refer to as abductive. There's all this abductive lighting up of stories. So the word there that's so beautiful is reminds. Reminds. That reminds me of a story.
Right.
Which is something that is our human right. This is in our human meadow of stories. Anyway, this has been a lovely conversation.
It has. Thank you so much for making time, Nora Bateson. It's been great.
Lance, it's always great to hang out with you.
You've been listening to the October 2025 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring Nora Bateson. If you like what you've heard, or even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics, if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education on a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's generalsemantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 38th episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck, signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time. And until then, just remember this simple fact, that the map is not the territory.